Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that sounds simple, but gets darker the longer you sit with it. What would it actually be like to wake up as a black person in colonial America? Not the version you learned in school with the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving, not the tricorn hats and quill pens and polite debates about liberty. The real version, the one where your skin color determined whether you were a person or a piece of property, where the laws were written specifically to control you, where the air you breathed and the ground you walked on belonged to someone who might own you too. This is the story of daily life in the colonies for black people. And the truth is, you wouldn't last a single day. Not because you're weak, but because the system was designed to be unsurvivable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes and the first thing you notice is the smell. It's a thick, layered scent of wood smoke and damp earth and unwashed bodies pressed close in a space too small for the number of people sleeping in it. You're lying on a wooden plank, maybe with a thin layer of straw beneath you, maybe without even that. The walls around you are rough-hewn logs or crude planks with gaps wide enough to let in the night air. And the air in the Virginia colony at 5 in the morning is sharp enough to bite. Your muscles ache before you've even moved. Yesterday's labor sits in your bones like something permanent, like something that has moved in and plans to stay. Your back, your shoulders, your hands, every part of you carries the memory of work that started before dawn and didn't end until the light was gone. This is the 1700s, somewhere in the Chesapeake region, and you are enslaved. Not metaphorically, not in some abstract political sense. You are the legal property of another human being who can sell you, beat you, separate you from your family, or work you to death without facing any meaningful consequence. The law doesn't see you as a person. It sees you as chattel, the same legal category as a horse or a plow, an asset to be maintained only insofar as you remain productive. You didn't choose to be here. Your parents didn't choose to be here. Someone was stolen from Africa, packed into the hold of a ship, survived a crossing that killed millions, and was sold at auction to the highest bidder. That chain of violence brought you to this moment, lying on a plank in a cabin that leaks when it rains. Waiting for the horn that will signal the start of another day, you have no choice but to endure. The horn sounds and you rise because the alternative is worse. You pull on the clothes you were given, a single set issued once or twice a year, rough Osnaburg fabric that scratches against skin and offers about as much comfort as wearing a burlap sack, which is essentially what it is. The shirt is too thin for winter and too heavy for summer. Designed not for your comfort, but for the minimum investment required to keep you clothed enough to work. Your shoes, if you have them, are stiff leather brogans that have never been shaped to a human foot, that rub blisters that never fully heal, because tomorrow you'll wear them again. Many enslaved people in the colonies went barefoot year-round, their feet toughening into leather themselves, calloused and cracked, and carrying them across ground that could be frozen hard or scorching hot depending on the season. Breakfast is not a meal, it's a ration. You receive cornmeal, maybe a small piece of salt pork if the enslaver is feeling generous, maybe nothing at all beyond what you manage to grow in the small garden plot you tend in whatever fragments of free time exist, which is to say, almost none. The food is prepared quickly, eaten quickly, and forgotten quickly because the workday doesn't wait. The overseer is already in the fields, and the overseer carries a whip, and the whip is not decorative. It is a tool of management, used as casually as a carpenter uses a hammer, applied to backs and shoulders and legs with a frequency that makes it part of the background noise of colonial plantation life. The tobacco fields stretch out before you, row after row of broad-leafed plants that represent the entire economic engine of the Chesapeake colonies. Tobacco built Virginia. Tobacco built Maryland. Tobacco made wealthy men out of people who might otherwise have been unremarkable English farmers, and it did so on the backs of enslaved black people whose labor turned seeds into the golden leaf that Europe couldn't get enough of. The work is not just hard. It's a year-round assault on your body that never lets up, that follows a calendar dictated by the plant itself, each season bringing its own form of misery. In the spring, you prepare the seedbeds, breaking ground with hoes that jar your arms with every stroke, bending to plant the tiny seeds that will grow into the crop that pays for your enslavement. The bending is constant, hour after hour, your back screaming in a language that has no words, your knees sinking into mud that might be cold or might be warm, but is always there, always pulling at you, always making the work harder than it needs to be. In summer, you worm and top the plants, walking down the rows inspecting each one, pulling the fat green hornworms off the leaves with your bare hands, pinching off the flowers to force the plant's energy into the leaves rather than the seeds. The worms burst between your fingers, their guts smearing across your skin, the tobacco resin building up on your hands until they're stained dark and sticky with a substance that makes your skin burn and your head swim. The nicotine in the tobacco plants absorbs through your skin. This is something that modern science understands, but that colonial workers experienced without explanation. The dizziness, the nausea, the headaches that come from handling tobacco plants for hours in the summer heat. These are symptoms of nicotine poisoning. Your body absorbing the drug through every pore, through every cut and scratch on hands that are never fully healed. Children working in the tobacco fields were especially vulnerable, their smaller bodies overwhelmed by doses of nicotine that might merely sicken an adult. Nobody understood why the workers felt ill. Nobody cared enough to investigate. You were expected to work through the sickness the same way you were expected to work through everything else. The harvest, in late summer and fall, was the most intense period, the cutting and hanging and curing of leaves that represented the year's profit. You cut the stalks with a heavy knife, loaded them onto carts, transported them to the curing barn where they hung in rows, the air thick with the smell of drying tobacco, the heat from the curing fires making the barn feel like the inside of an oven. Someone had to tend those fires around the clock, keeping the temperature steady, watching for sparks that could burn the entire crop and the barn with it. That someone was you, sitting in the stifling heat through the night, fighting sleep because a moment's inattention could mean disaster, and disaster meant punishment that your body couldn't afford. The curing process took weeks, and during those weeks, your already impossible workload doubled because the regular work of the plantation didn't stop just because the tobacco needed tending. Once the leaves were cured, the work shifted to stripping and packing. You sat for hours pulling the dried leaves from their stems, sorting them by quality, pressing them into hogsheads, the massive barrels that would carry the tobacco to market. The stripping was tedious work that left your fingers raw and stained, the dried leaves brittle enough to cut skin, the dust from the process filling your lungs with every breath. A single hogshead held 1,000 pounds of tobacco and represented weeks of labor from planting to packing, and the profit from that hogshead went entirely to the person who claimed to own you. Winter didn't bring rest. it brought different work. Clearing land, cutting timber, splitting rails for fences, repairing buildings, digging ditches, preparing tools for the next planting season. The cold in the Chesapeake could be bitter, and your clothing offered almost no protection against it. Your hands cracked and bled from the cold and the work. Your feet, bare or poorly shod, ached with a cold that went beyond discomfort into something that felt like the earth itself was trying to consume you. Frostbite was common, the damage accumulating over winters, toes and fingers gradually losing sensation, gradually losing function. The cost of laboring in conditions that no amount of clothing could adequately address. But the tobacco fields were only part of your day. Colonial plantations were self-sustaining operations that required constant maintenance, constant labor, constant human effort directed at 1,000 tasks that kept the estate running. You might spend the morning in the fields and the afternoon splitting wood, or repairing fences, or hauling water from the well, or clearing new ground with nothing but an axe and your own exhausted body, or any of the 100 other tasks that the overseer assigned based on what needed doing and who was available to do it. There was no specialization for most field workers, no sense of completing one job and moving to the next. There was just work, an unending river of it, flowing from before dawn until after dark, filling every moment that wasn't dedicated to the bare minimum of sleeping and eating. The rice and indigo plantations further south were worse still in their own ways. In the Carolina Low Country, enslaved workers stood in water for hours at a time, cultivating rice in conditions that bred malaria, yellow fever, and a dozen other diseases. The mortality rates on rice plantations were so high that the enslaved population couldn't sustain itself through reproduction alone. New workers had to be constantly imported, purchased, brought in to replace the ones who died. Indigo processing was a chemical nightmare. The fermentation of the plants producing fumes that sickened workers, the liquid waste creating breeding grounds for insects, the entire process so unpleasant that one observer described the stench as being detectable from a mile away. These were the cash crops that built the colonial economy, and they were built on the destruction of black bodies. The laws governing your existence in colonial America were not accidental. They were carefully constructed over decades to create a system of racial control that left no room for ambiguity about your place in society. The Virginia slave codes, which began taking shape in the mid-1600s and hardened into comprehensive legislation by the early 1700s, defined you as property, not as a person with reduced rights, not as a second-class citizen, but as property, the same legal category as a barrel of tobacco or a team of oxen. These codes touched every aspect of your life. You could not own property. You could not testify against white people in court. You could not gather in groups without white supervision. You could not leave the plantation without a written pass from your enslaver. You could not learn to read or write, because literacy was power, and power was something the system could not allow you to have. You could not strike a white person, even in self-defense, even if that white person was beating you to death. The penalty for striking a white person could be death, and the penalty for a white person killing an enslaved person was, in practice, nothing. The legal architecture was designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance or independence. Laws prohibited enslaved people from carrying weapons, from owning dogs, from playing drums, because drums could carry messages, could coordinate, could organize. Laws made it illegal for free black people to shelter runaways, made it illegal for white people to teach enslaved people, made it illegal for anyone to treat you as anything other than what the law said you were, a thing to be used. The courts enforced these laws with a consistency that revealed their true purpose. This wasn't about maintaining order. It was about maintaining a racial hierarchy that enriched white colonists at the expense of black lives. The punishment system was the enforcement mechanism, and it was designed to be public, painful, and terrifying. Whipping was the standard punishment for almost any infraction, from working too slowly, to speaking too loudly, to being in a place you weren't supposed to be. The whip was a constant presence, carried by overseers as naturally as they carried their hats, used with a casualness that revealed how thoroughly the system had normalized violence against black bodies. A slave who ran away might receive 39 lashes. A slave who was caught stealing food might receive 20. A slave who looked at a white person the wrong way might receive whatever number the overseer felt like administering that day. But whipping was only the beginning. Colonial punishment for enslaved people included branding, the application of hot iron to skin, marking you as a runaway or a thief, or simply as someone's property. It included ear cropping, the slicing away of ears as punishment and identification. It included hanging, for offences that might have earned a white person a fine or a brief imprisonment. And it included punishments that defy description, creative cruelties devised by individual enslavers who answered to no one and who viewed their enslaved workers as objects upon which any violence could be inflicted. The legal system that governed enslaved people was not a justice system. It was a control system, designed to maintain the power of the enslaving class by making resistance impossible and submission mandatory. When an enslaved person was accused of a crime, the trial was conducted by a special court, usually consisting of local slaveholders, the very people who had the most interest in maintaining the system. There was no jury of peers, no right to counsel, no presumption of innocence. The verdict was predetermined by a system that needed enslaved people to be guilty, that needed punishment to be visible and terrifying, that needed every black person in the colony to understand that the law existed not to protect them, but to control them. If you were not enslaved, if you were one of the small number of free black people in the colonies, your situation was marginally better in theory and barely distinguishable in practice. Free black people in colonial America occupied a precarious space, their freedom always conditional, always threatened, always dependent on the willingness of white society to tolerate their existence. You could own property in some colonies, but your property could be taken. You could work for wages, but you couldn't charge what white workers charged. You could exist in public spaces, but you were always watched, always suspected, always one accusation away from losing everything. The laws that governed free black people were designed to discourage freedom itself, to make the status of free black persons so difficult that it served as no temptation to enslaved people who might dream of liberty. In Virginia, free black people could not vote, could not serve on juries, could not testify against white people in court. They could be required to carry papers proving their free status at all times, and failure to produce those papers could result in arrest, imprisonment, and even re-enslavement. They were prohibited from owning firearms in many colonies, prohibited from gathering in groups, subjected to curfews that white people were not. The fear that hung over free black communities was the fear of kidnapping. Free black people, especially children, were vulnerable to being seized and sold into slavery by unscrupulous traders who knew that a black person's word carried no weight in a colonial court. If someone claimed you were their runaway slave, you had almost no legal means of disproving the claim. Your freedom papers could be destroyed. Your witnesses could be intimidated or simply not believed. The courts were not your ally. They were part of the same system that created and maintained slavery, and they functioned accordingly. Your social world in colonial America was shaped entirely by the institution of slavery, even if you were not personally enslaved. The relationships you could form, the places you could go, the work you could do, all of it was constrained by a racial hierarchy that placed black people at the bottom and enforced that placement with violence and law. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal recognition. Your enslaver could separate you from your spouse at any time, could sell your children to a buyer in another colony, could break apart the family you had built without warning and without recourse. The bonds of kinship were treated as irrelevant to the economic calculations that governed enslaved lives, as inconveniences to be tolerated when convenient and severed when profit demanded. Here's the thing that makes colonial slavery even more painful to understand. It wasn't always this way, at least not in the earliest decades. When the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, the rigid racial slavery that would define America hadn't fully crystallized yet. Some of those early arrivals were treated as indentured servants, not permanent slaves. They worked for a term of years and then gained their freedom, just as white indentured servants did. Anthony Johnson, who arrived in Virginia around 1621 as an enslaved man, eventually gained his freedom, acquired land, raised cattle, and even held indentured servants himself. For a brief, complicated window, the lines between black and white servitude were blurry, the racial caste system not yet hardened into the permanent horror it would become. But that window closed fast, as the demand for labor grew and the supply of white indentured servants declined. The colonial elite made a deliberate choice to create a permanent, hereditary, racially defined labor force. The laws that emerged in the 1660s and 1670s drew the lines with increasing sharpness. A 1662 Virginia law declared that the status of a child followed the status of the mother, meaning that any child born to an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved regardless of who the father was. This single law created a self-perpetuating system. Enslavers could increase their workforce through the reproductive capacity of enslaved women, and every child born in the quarters was born into bondage. A 1667 law declared that baptism did not grant freedom, closing a loophole that some enslaved people had tried to use. A 1691 law prohibited interracial marriage and imposed penalties on white women who bore children by black or mixed-race men. Each new law added another brick to the wall, separating black from white, slave from free, person from property. The racial divide was also a strategy to prevent the kind of cross-racial solidarity that had terrified the colonial elite. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 saw poor whites and poor blacks fighting together against the colonial government, and the ruling class never forgot that lesson. In the aftermath, they deliberately drove a wedge between black and white workers, giving poor whites just enough privilege to make them identify with their wealthy white neighbors, rather than with the black people who shared their economic condition. The slave codes that followed Bacon's rebellion were designed not just to control black people, but to create a racial hierarchy that poor whites would defend, because it gave them someone to look down on. And yet, within these constraints, black people in colonial America built lives of extraordinary richness and resilience. They formed families and fought to keep them together, sometimes across plantation boundaries, husbands walking miles on their one free evening to visit wives who belonged to different enslavers. They created communities that sustained members through the worst that the system could inflict, sharing food when rations ran short, caring for the sick when enslavers wouldn't provide doctors, raising each other's children when parents were sold away. They developed cultural practices that drew on African traditions and adapted them to American conditions, creating music and storytelling and spiritual practices that would eventually reshape the culture of the entire nation. They maintained networks of communication that spanned plantations and colonies, sharing news and strategies and hope in whispered conversations that the enslavers couldn't hear. Religion became a source of strength and resistance, though it was also used as a tool of control. Enslavers encouraged Christianity among enslaved people when it suited them, emphasizing passages about servants obeying their masters, using the church as another mechanism of submission. But enslaved people heard different messages in the same text, finding in the story of Exodus a narrative of liberation, finding in the Psalms words that spoke to their suffering, finding in the promise of heaven a declaration that the current order was not permanent, that justice would come even if it didn't come in this life. The brush arbor meetings, secret gatherings held in the woods away from white surveillance, became spaces where enslaved people could worship on their own terms, could sing and pray and speak freely, could maintain spiritual lives that belonged to them alone. The physical landscape of colonial life for black people was a landscape of surveillance and restriction. The plantation was a controlled space where every movement could be monitored, where the absence of a worker would be noticed, where the geography itself was designed to limit autonomy. Beyond the plantation, the roads were dangerous for any black person traveling without papers. The patrols that policed the countryside authorized to stop, question, and punish anyone who seemed out of place. The woods that bordered the plantations were both threatening and promising, hiding dangers from animals and exposure, but also offering the possibility of escape, of temporary freedom, of a few hours away from the constant gaze of those who claimed to own you. Some enslaved people established maroon communities in the swamps and forests, settlements of runaways who had escaped and built lives beyond the reach of their enslavers. The Great Dismal Swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border harbored communities of escaped people for generations, its impenetrable landscape providing natural fortification against those who would recapture them. Life in the swamp was hard, the conditions brutal, the food uncertain, the danger constant, but it was free, and for some people, that was enough to make any hardship bearable. If you imagine that the northern colonies were different, that life for black people in Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or New York was somehow gentler, think again. Slavery existed in every colony, from Georgia to New Hampshire. And while the scale was different in the North, the fundamental reality was the same. Black people were property, and property had no rights. New York City in the colonial era had one of the largest enslaved populations in the North. The labor of enslaved people building the homes and businesses and infrastructure that made the city function. The 1712 slave revolt in New York, in which enslaved people set fire to a building and then attacked the white people who came to put it out, resulted in the execution of 21 people. Some of them burned alive, some broken on the wheel, some hung in chains to die slowly of exposure. The punishment was designed to be so extreme, so theatrical, so utterly disproportionate that it would prevent any future resistance through sheer terror. The 1741 New York conspiracy, whether it was real or imagined, resulted in the execution of 34 people, 17 hanged and 13 burned at the stake, with another 70 banished from the colony. The trials were driven by panic and rumor, the evidence thin, the confessions extracted through torture and the threat of burning. Whether a genuine conspiracy existed or whether the whole episode was a product of white paranoia matters less than what the response reveals. about the colonial approach to black resistance. Any hint of organized action by black people was met with a violence so extreme that it served as its own argument for the system's continuation. The cities offered different constraints than the plantations, but constraints nonetheless. In Charleston, in Williamsburg, in the port towns of the northern colonies, enslaved and free black people navigated urban spaces where proximity to white society brought both opportunities and dangers. Skilled enslaved workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, shipwrights moved through the streets with a relative freedom that field workers couldn't imagine, but that freedom was always supervised, always revocable, always dependent on the pleasure of the person who owned them. Some hired themselves out with their enslavers' permission, keeping a portion of their earnings, accumulating the small sums that might eventually purchase freedom for themselves or their families. The markets and taverns where black people gathered to trade, to talk, to maintain social connections were watched by authorities who feared any gathering might become a conspiracy, any conversation might become a plan. The food you ate in colonial America as a black person was a study in deprivation and ingenuity. The rations provided by enslavers were calculated to maintain working capacity at minimum cost. Cornmeal, salt pork, occasionally rice or wheat, rarely anything fresh or varied. The monotony was nutritional as well as culinary, the diet lacking in vitamins and minerals that the body needed, creating deficiency diseases that sapped energy and shortened lives. Pellagra from niacin deficiency, scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from insufficient vitamin D. These were common among enslaved people whose diets were determined by economic calculation rather than nutritional need. But enslaved people supplemented their rations whenever they could, drawing on knowledge of plants and animals that had been carried from Africa and adapted to American conditions. They fished in streams and rivers when time permitted, using techniques their ancestors had perfected on other continents. They trapped small game, rabbits and possums and raccoons, adding protein to a diet that was dangerously deficient. They cultivated garden plots where they grew vegetables that the enslavers wouldn't provide. Okra brought from West Africa, black-eyed peas that connected them to agricultural traditions older than the colonies themselves, sweet potatoes and greens and peppers that added nutrition and flavor to meals that would otherwise have been barely edible. The cooking techniques they developed, making flavor and nutrition from the cheapest and least desirable ingredients, from the parts of animals that white households discarded, the offal and the feet and the necks and the tails, would eventually become the foundation of Southern cuisine, a culinary tradition created by people who were never credited for their contributions. The medical care available to you in colonial America as a black person ranged from inadequate to dangerous. Enslavers sometimes called doctors for enslaved workers, not out of compassion, but out of financial calculation, protecting their investment the way they might call a veterinarian for a sick horse. But the doctors of the colonial era were barely more effective than no treatment at all. Their understanding of disease rooted in theories about humours and miasmas that bore no relationship to actual causes. Bloodletting, purging, blistering. These were the standard treatments, applied with equal enthusiasm to conditions they couldn't help and conditions they actively made worse. Enslaved people often preferred their own healers, men and women who carried knowledge of herbal medicine from Africa and who had developed treatments through generations of observation and experimentation that were sometimes more effective than anything European medicine could offer. They knew which barks reduced fever, which roots eased pain, which leaves could be applied to wounds to prevent infection. This knowledge was precious and carefully guarded, passed from healer to apprentice in a chain of transmission that connected colonial America to African medical traditions stretching back centuries. The midwives who delivered babies in the slave quarters were essential figures in enslaved communities. Their skills passed down through generations of women who understood pregnancy and childbirth in ways that male colonial doctors did not. They knew which herbs eased labor, which plants controlled bleeding, which teas strengthened mothers after delivery. Their knowledge saved lives that the colonial medical establishment couldn't have saved, and their presence in the quarters meant that the most vulnerable moments of human existence, birth and illness and death, were attended by people who actually cared about the outcomes, who saw the people they served as human beings rather than property. The night brought its own terrors and its own possibilities. After the work was done, after the rations were eaten, after the overseer withdrew to his own quarters, the slave quarters became a space of relative autonomy, the only hours of the day that belonged, however imperfectly, to the people who lived there. This was when families came together, when parents held children they had barely seen during the daylight hours, when stories were told in languages that carried fragments of Yoruba and Igbo and Wolof and Mende, mixed with the English that necessity demanded. The music that emerged from these quarters, the work songs and spirituals and field hollers, carried multiple layers of meaning, expressing grief and hope and resistance in forms that could be heard by everyone, but understood fully only by those who shared the experience. But the night was also when the patrols rode, when the paddy rollers, as enslaved people called them, moved through the countryside looking for anyone away from their plantation without permission. The sound of hooves on a dirt road carried for miles in the stillness of a colonial night, and that sound meant danger, meant the possibility of a beating, meant the possibility of being caught somewhere you weren't supposed to be, doing something you weren't supposed to do, being something you weren't supposed to be, a person with desires and relationships and a will of your own. The patrols were staffed by poor whites who relished the authority the system gave them, who took pleasure in exercising power over people they were told were beneath them, who enforced the slave codes with an enthusiasm that revealed how much their own sense of worth depended on the degradation of others. The night was when escapes were attempted, when the bravest or most desperate made their moves toward a freedom that was geographically remote, legally precarious, and physically dangerous. Running meant traveling through unfamiliar territory without maps, without provisions, without certainty about which direction led to safety and which led to capture. It meant following rivers and stars, hiding during the day, moving at night through forests that harbored predators both animal and human. It meant leaving behind everyone you loved with no guarantee that you would ever see them again, trading the known suffering of slavery for the unknown dangers of flight. Most who ran were caught and returned, their punishment a message to everyone who remained. But some made it, and their success, whispered from plantation to plantation, kept alive the possibility that escape was real, that freedom existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the people who lived through colonial America as black men and women and children, who woke every morning to a system designed to extract everything from them and give nothing in return. Think about the mother who worked the tobacco fields all day and then stayed up half the night nursing a sick child with remedies she learned from her own mother. Remedies that carried the wisdom of African healers across an ocean and through generations of bondage. Think about the father who was sold away from his family and carried their memory for the rest of his life. never knowing what became of the children he'd held as infants, never stopping the quiet search for news that might tell him they were alive. Think about the craftsman whose skill built the finest houses in the colony, but who could never own a home himself, whose work would outlast him by centuries, while his name was forgotten before the mortar dried. Think about the preacher who whispered words of liberation in the brush arbor, knowing that discovery could mean death, but speaking anyway, because the words needed to be said, because the people who gathered in the dark needed to hear that their suffering was not the last word. Think about the children who grew up inside this system, who learned before they could read because reading was forbidden, that the world was divided into people who owned and people who were owned, and that they were on the wrong side of that division through no fault of their own. Think about what it took to raise a child with hope in a world designed to destroy hope, to teach a child to love themselves in a system built on the premise that they were worthless. Think about the acts of defiance that were too small to make the history books, but that mattered enormously to the people who performed them. The extra food hidden for a hungry child, the slow pace when the overseer wasn't watching, the song that carried a hidden message, the name whispered in the dark that connected a person to ancestors the enslavers wanted them to forget. But think also about what they built despite everything. The families they formed and reformed when slavery tore them apart, finding new ways to love and care for each other, even when the law said their bonds meant nothing. The communities they maintained against all odds, networks of mutual support, and shared knowledge that sustained people through conditions designed to be unsurvivable. The culture they created from the fragments of African tradition and American reality, a culture so powerful that it would eventually reshape the nation that had enslaved them, influencing its music, its food, its language, its very soul. The knowledge they preserved and passed down, the survival strategies and healing practices and agricultural techniques and musical traditions that sustained them through generations of oppression and that still sustain their descendants today. Colonial America was built on the promise of freedom, but that promise was never meant for everyone. The men who wrote about liberty and natural rights did so while owning human beings, and the contradiction didn't trouble them enough to resolve it. But the people they enslaved understood freedom better than any philosopher who had never been denied it. They understood it because they lived without it, because they dreamed of it, because they risked everything to reach for it, because they built spaces of freedom within bondage that the enslavers could never fully control. You wouldn't last a day in colonial America as a black person, and they lasted lifetimes. That endurance, that stubborn refusal to be destroyed, that insistence on creating beauty and meaning and love in the darkest circumstances, is what carries forward through history, what connects past to present, what deserves to be remembered as you drift into peaceful sleep tonight. Congratulations, you're free. You have the papers to prove it, folded carefully in your pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. Maybe your grandmother was freed by an enslaver who had a crisis of conscience on his deathbed. Maybe your mother saved for 20 years, hiring herself out on Sundays, scraping together enough coin to purchase her own flesh from the man who claimed to own it. Maybe you were born to parents who were already free, which makes you one of the lucky ones, though lucky is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Either way, you're not enslaved. You can't be sold. You can't be whipped at another man's pleasure. You can't be separated from your family on a Tuesday because someone needed cash. The good news ends there. Because being free and being safe are two entirely different things. And in the antebellum South, free black people learned that distinction the hard way, every single day, from the moment they woke up until the moment they manage to fall into an uneasy sleep. Let's start with the papers, because those papers are your life. Without them, you're presumed to be an escaped slave. With them, you're merely a suspicious anomaly that makes white people uncomfortable. Your freedom papers need to be registered with the local court, which means white officials know exactly who you are, where you live, and that you exist in a category they find philosophically troubling. Every time you travel, even to the next county, you need to carry those papers. Every time a white person demands to see them, you need to produce them immediately, with a smile, with deference, with gratitude for being allowed to prove you're not property. If your papers get lost, stolen, damaged, or destroyed, you have a serious problem. Replacing them requires going back to court, finding witnesses who can testify to your status, paying fees you probably can't afford, and hoping the judge is in a generous mood, rather than the mood that says maybe this one should be sold for the county's benefit. Some free black people carried multiple copies. Some memorized the exact wording so they could recite it if needed. Some sewed papers into the linings of their clothes. The paranoia was justified. Without documentation, freedom evaporated like morning fog. Here's where it gets really precarious. The entire Southern economy depended on slavery, and free black people represented a living contradiction to the ideology that made slavery possible. If black people could be free, could work, could own property, could raise families, could exist as human beings rather than livestock, then maybe the whole system was built on a lie. That possibility made white Southerners deeply uncomfortable. And when white Southerners got uncomfortable, black people suffered. The slavocracy needed everyone to believe that black people were inherently inferior, naturally suited for bondage, incapable of self-governance. Every free black person who worked hard, raised a family, stayed out of trouble, and lived a respectable life was a walking refutation of that ideology. And ideologies under threat tend to produce desperate measures. So the laws governing free black lives were designed to make freedom as miserable as possible without technically being slavery. You couldn't vote, obviously. The ballot box was for white men only, and your opinions on governance were not requested. You couldn't testify against white people in court, which meant any white person could rob you, assault you, or destroy your property with near impunity. If a white man walked into your shop, took what he wanted, and walked out without paying, your only recourse was to find another white person willing to testify on your behalf, which was roughly as likely as finding gold in your breakfast porridge. You couldn't own firearms in most places, leaving you defenseless against the very people most likely to harm you. You couldn't gather in groups without white supervision, because apparently free black people sitting around talking was a threat to civilization itself. 3 black men discussing the weather might be plotting rebellion, as far as white authorities were concerned. You couldn't learn to read in some states, and you definitely couldn't teach other black people to read, because literacy was power, and power was dangerous in the wrong hands. You couldn't preach without a license, and licenses were hard to get and easy to revoke, because the authorities worried about what you might say and who might listen. You couldn't own certain types of property in certain places. You couldn't enter certain professions. You couldn't travel freely. You couldn't marry who you wanted, at least not legally, not in ways the state would recognize. You were free, technically, but freedom came with an asterisk the size of a plantation, and the fine print went on for pages. Now imagine trying to make a living under these conditions. You wake up in whatever cramped room or small house you've managed to secure, and you need to work because nobody's providing for you. Unlike enslaved people who were fed and housed by their enslavers, however inadequately, you were on your own. Your meals depended on your earnings. Your shelter depended on your rent. Every expense came out of your own pocket, and your pocket had holes in it that the law kept cutting wider. But the jobs available to free black people were limited by law and custom to the lowest rungs of the economy. You could be a laborer, hauling and lifting until your back gave out, competing with enslaved workers who could be hired out for less than you needed to survive. You could be a domestic servant, cleaning white people's houses and raising white people's children, invisible in their homes while being indispensable to their comfort. You could work on the docks, loading and unloading ships in the blistering heat, surrounded by enslaved workers doing the same jobs, the line between free and enslaved blurring in the sweat and exhaustion. You could be a craftsman if you'd somehow acquired a skill, a blacksmith or carpenter or barber or shoemaker. But even then, you faced restrictions that white craftsmen didn't face. Some cities required you to have a white guardian or sponsor who would vouch for your behavior and your business practices. Some states prohibited you from certain trades entirely, protecting white workers from the competition of black workers who might be willing to charge less or work harder. In some places, you couldn't hire white workers even if your business grew large enough to need help, because the sight of a white person working for a black person violated the natural order of things. If you were good at what you did, if you prospered even modestly, you attracted attention and resentment. A free black person with a nice coat or a well-built house was an offense against the entire ideology of white supremacy, a living argument that black people could thrive if given half a chance. And making that argument too loudly could get you killed. Let's talk about the guardian system, because this was one of the more insidious mechanisms of control. In many southern states, free black people were required to have a white guardian, essentially a sponsor who took legal responsibility for their behavior. This guardian could be a former enslaver, a sympathetic white friend, or simply someone willing to take on the role for a fee. Without a guardian, you might not be able to conduct business, sign contracts, or even remain in the state. The guardian had power over you that looked uncomfortably like ownership. They could restrict your movements, control your finances, and in some cases hire you out to other white people and keep the wages. If your guardian died, moved away, or simply decided they didn't want the responsibility anymore, you were suddenly unmoored, scrambling to find someone else willing to take on a role that most white people found distasteful or simply not worth the trouble. The system transformed freedom into a kind of supervised parole, with white people serving as perpetual probation officers for the crime of the existing while black. And then there were the taxes. Free black people in the antebellum South paid special taxes that white people didn't pay, essentially fines for the audacity of not being enslaved. Some states charged an annual head tax on every free black resident. Some required free black people to pay for their own registration, their own court appearances, their own documentation of a status that should have been self-evident. The money went into state coffers, or sometimes into the pockets of the officials collecting it, and the effect was to make free black life economically precarious even when work was available. You earned less than white workers, paid more in taxes and fees, faced restrictions on accumulating property, and lived one bad month away from disaster. Some free black people who fell behind on taxes or fees found themselves sold into slavery to cover the debt. Freedom, it turned out, had a price that came due annually, and if you couldn't pay, the state would find a way to reclaim what it had reluctantly granted. Here's something that kept free black people awake at night: kidnapping. The domestic slave trade was booming in the antebellum period, with enslaved people from the Upper South being sold to the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South at enormous profit. A healthy young black man could fetch over $1,000 at auction, a sum that represented years of wages for most white workers. A skilled craftsman might bring even more. Women of childbearing age were valuable for their labor and their potential to produce more enslaved workers. Children were investments in future labor. This created a powerful incentive for unscrupulous men to grab free black people off the streets, destroy their papers, and sell them into slavery hundreds of miles from anyone who might recognize them. Professional kidnappers operated throughout the South and even ventured into northern states to snatch victims. They worked alone or in gangs, sometimes with the cooperation of corrupt officials who would certify stolen people as legitimate property. They had networks of contacts, safe houses where victims could be held, forged documents that created paper trails of ownership. Some posed as legitimate slave traders. Others operated as outright criminals, grabbing people in the night and transporting them before anyone knew they were missing. The techniques were sophisticated because the profits were substantial, and the risks were minimal, given that a kidnapped person couldn't testify against their kidnappers. Once you were sold and transported, proving your free status became nearly impossible. You couldn't testify in court against white people. You had no papers because they'd been destroyed or confiscated. You were in a strange place where no one knew you, where no one had any reason to believe you over the white man who claimed to own you. Your word meant nothing against the bill of sale that some white man had fabricated. Even if you managed to get word to family or friends back home, what could they do? Travel hundreds of miles to testify in a court that didn't want to hear from them? Hire lawyers with money they didn't have? The system was designed to make recovery impossible. The stories of free black people who spent decades in slavery after being kidnapped, who sometimes never escaped at all, who died in bondage protesting to the end that they were free. These stories were common knowledge in free black communities. Parents warned children never to go anywhere alone. People traveled in groups when possible, hoping that numbers would discourage kidnappers looking for easy targets. Some simply never left their immediate neighborhoods, accepting a constrained life as the price of a safer one. The fear was constant, justified, and impossible to ever completely escape. Every stranger was potentially dangerous. Every journey was a risk calculation. The legal system offered little protection and considerable danger. Remember, you couldn't testify against white people. This single restriction undermined any possibility of justice. So if a white man beat you, robbed you, or burned down your house, you couldn't take the stand to describe what happened. You couldn't point at your attacker and say, "This is the man who did it." You couldn't present your side of the story to judge or jury. You needed a white witness willing to testify on your behalf. And white witnesses willing to testify against other white people on behalf of a black person were rare creatures, indeed. Those who did often faced social consequences, being labeled as race traitors or troublemakers, finding their own standing in the community damaged by association with your cause. The courts were staffed by white judges elected by white voters, interpreting laws written by white legislators, applying standards that assumed black inferiority as a given. White juries decided cases involving black defendants, and those juries generally believed that black people were inferior, that slavery was right and natural, and that free black people were a nuisance at best and a menace at worst. Getting justice in this system was like trying to win a game where the other side made all the rules and could change them whenever convenient. The dice were loaded, the deck was stacked, and the house always won. And if you were accused of a crime, heaven help you. black defendants faced harsher sentences than white defendants for identical offenses. The presumption of innocence that supposedly governed American courts evaporated when the defendant was black. Juries were quick to convict and judges were quick to sentence. For minor offenses that would earn white people fines or short jail terms, black defendants might face years of labor, public whipping, or worse. Some free black people convicted of crimes were sold into slavery as punishment, their freedom forfeit over offenses that barely qualified as misdemeanors when committed by white people. The threat of the courtroom was another tool of control, another reminder that your freedom existed at the sufferance of a system designed to deny it. Let's talk about the constant threat of expulsion, because your right to remain in the state where you'd built your entire life was never secure. Throughout the antebellum period, Southern states passed increasingly restrictive laws aimed at reducing the free black population. Some states required newly freed black people to leave within a certain period or face re-enslavement. Some prohibited free black people from other states from entering, trapping existing residents while preventing others from joining them. Some states periodically debated whether to expel all free black people entirely, sending them to Liberia or some other distant place, eliminating the troublesome reminder that black and free could exist in the same body. Even when these expulsion proposals failed to become law, the debates themselves sent a message. You were tolerated, not accepted. Your presence was a problem that white people were constantly trying to solve. The ground beneath your feet was never stable. The community you'd built, the business you'd established, the family you'd raised could be swept away by a single legislative session if the political wind shifted. Free black people lived with this uncertainty constantly, knowing that their status depended not on rights, but on the fluctuating tolerance of people who saw them as a mistake. Movement was particularly fraught. If you needed to travel, to visit family in another county, to deliver goods to a customer, to attend a funeral or a wedding, to seek work in a nearby town, you faced a gauntlet of checkpoints, both official and informal. You needed your papers, obviously, but papers were not always enough. You also needed to avoid attracting the attention of the slave patrols that roamed the roads looking for runaways. These patrols, called patty rollers in the vernacular of the time, had the authority to stop any black person, free or enslaved, and demand proof of status. The patrols were often poor white men, resentful of their own position at the bottom of white society, taking out their frustrations on people they considered beneath them. They had legal authority and no oversight. They could stop you, question you, search your belongings, examine your papers with illiterate scrutiny, and decide whether you looked like someone who should be out on the road. Being stopped by a patrol meant being questioned about where you came from and where you were going, why you were traveling, and who could vouch for you. It meant being searched for weapons, for stolen goods, for messages that might be passing between enslaved people. It meant sometimes being beaten even when your papers were in order, because the papers said you were free, but the patrol said you had a suspicious attitude. And who was the court going to believe? Your word against theirs wasn't even admissible as evidence. Some free black people simply stopped traveling, limiting their lives to a small radius where they were known, where local whites could vouch for them, where the danger of a random encounter with strangers was minimized. This meant turning down opportunities, missing family events, letting the world shrink to a size that felt manageable rather than the size it should have been. Others traveled only in groups, hoping numbers would provide some protection, hoping that witnesses might discourage the worst abuses. They traveled during daylight when possible, along known routes, carrying documentation of their destinations as well as their origins. Everyone knew someone who had been detained, beaten, jailed, or worse simply for being in the wrong place while black. The roads were not free, no matter what your papers said. The social isolation was grinding. You existed in a middle space that belonged to no one, neither fully free nor enslaved, neither accepted by whites nor entirely trusted by the enslaved. Enslaved people might view you with suspicion, wondering if you thought yourself better than them, wondering if you would use your relative freedom to help them or to distance yourself from their condition, wondering whose side you were really on when push came to shove. Some enslaved people resented free black people for enjoying privileges they were denied. Others admired and envied them. The relationships were complicated by the chasm of legal status that separated people who might otherwise have been natural allies. White people viewed you as a contradiction and a threat, a living refutation of everything they believed about race and destiny. Your very existence argued against the ideology that justified slavery, and that made you dangerous regardless of how carefully you conducted yourself. You couldn't socialize with white people as equals, obviously. The color line was absolute in social situations, policed by custom and violence. But your interactions with enslaved people were also constrained by law and circumstance. Marrying an enslaved person meant your children would be born into slavery, following the condition of the mother. That knowledge haunted every romantic relationship that crossed the line between free and enslaved. Love was insufficient protection against a legal system that didn't recognize black love as worthy of protection. Befriending enslaved people too publicly attracted scrutiny, since white people worried that free black people would spread dangerous ideas about freedom, would help enslaved people escape, would foment the rebellions that slaveholders feared constantly. You had to be careful about who you talked to, how long you talked, what you were seen doing. Even innocent interactions could be interpreted as conspiracy. Some free black people owned enslaved people themselves, a fact that complicates any simple narrative about this period. Sometimes this ownership was a legal fiction to protect family members they couldn't otherwise free, a spouse or child purchased, but not manumitted because the law made manumission difficult or impossible. Sometimes it was genuine investment in the system that oppressed them. Free black people buying enslaved workers to run their businesses, participating in an economy built on bondage, because that was the only economy available. The moral compromises required to survive were constant and corrosive. You did what you had to do, and you tried not to think too hard about what that did to your soul. But the thinking came anyway, in quiet moments, in sleepless nights, in the face of your reflection. Now let's talk about family, because maintaining a family as a free black person in the antebellum South was an exercise in constant anxiety that would drive modern people to madness. If your spouse was enslaved, they could be sold at any moment, sent hundreds of miles away, and there was nothing you could do about it legally. You could beg. You could try to scrape together money to purchase them. You could appeal to the enslaver's sense of decency, if any existed. But in the end, they were property, and property could be disposed of as the owner saw fit. You might wake up one morning to find that your husband or wife had been sold overnight, that they were already on a wagon heading south, that you would never see them again as long as you lived. If your children were born to an enslaved mother, they were born enslaved regardless of your status, following the legal principle that children inherited the condition of the mother. You might have to watch your own children grow up in bondage, might have to see them working in fields or houses, might have to witness them being disciplined by enslavers who had no stake in their well-being. You might have to purchase your own children if you ever wanted them free, going to their legal owner with hat in hand, negotiating a price for flesh that you had helped create. You might have to see them sold away before you could accumulate enough money, shipped off to distant plantations while you stood helpless, their cries fading down the road. Some free black men worked for decades to purchase their wives and children, saving every penny, taking extra jobs, denying themselves comforts, only to see the prices rise faster than their savings. The enslaver might change their mind, might decide they wanted more money, might simply refuse to sell because they enjoyed the power of refusal. Some men finally succeeded, after years of effort, and then faced the realization that they now technically own their own family members, a legal relationship that twisted something sacred into something obscene. Manumitting purchased family members was itself complicated, sometimes requiring court approval, sometimes forbidden by law, sometimes triggering requirements that the freed person leave the state. The bureaucracy of bondage wrapped itself around families like chains, constraining even when it couldn't directly enslave. The emotional toll was immense. Every pregnancy was shadowed by fear about the child's status. Every birth was complicated by calculations of freedom and bondage. Every family gathering reminded you of who wasn't there, who might not be there next time, whose presence depended on the whims of white people who saw them as property. The anxiety never fully lifted. You couldn't plan for the future because the future was contingent on forces beyond your control. You loved knowing that love might not be enough to keep your family together. That knowledge sat in your chest like a stone, cold and heavy and impossible to forget. The church was supposed to be a refuge, and in some ways it was. Free black people in the antebellum South built their own congregations when they could, finding in religion a space where they could gather, sing, pray, and support each other. The church was one of the few institutions they could control, one of the few places where black leadership was possible, one of the few spaces where the constant performance of deference could be set aside, if only for a few hours. In church, a black man could be a deacon, a leader, a voice of authority. A black woman could sing without apology, could feel the Spirit move through her without worrying about white disapproval. The sanctuary was a space apart, and that apartness was precious. But even churches were regulated by the suspicious white gaze. Many states required that a white minister be present at all black religious gatherings, presumably to ensure that nothing seditious was being preached, that no plans for rebellion were being hatched beneath the cover of hymns. This white observer sat in judgment, listening for anything that might suggest resistance, anything that might need to be reported to the authorities. The presence poisoned the sanctuary, made even prayer feel supervised, turned worship into performance. Some states prohibited black churches entirely after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, blaming religious gatherings for fomenting resistance, seeing in every prayer meeting a potential conspiracy. Turner had been a preacher, and his rebellion had terrified white Southerners into crackdowns that lasted for decades. Where independent black churches existed, they were watched, harassed, sometimes burned. Ministers were questioned about their sermons. Congregations were dispersed by patrols. The message was clear. Even your relationship with God had to be supervised by white people. Even your prayers were suspect. Even your hope for salvation needed to be approved by those who saw themselves as your earthly masters. Some free black people attended white churches, sitting in segregated sections, listening to sermons that told them slavery was divine will, that obedience was their highest calling, that their proper place was somewhere below the white people who claimed to be saving their souls. The spiritual nourishment such churches offered was thin indeed, mixed with poison, telling you that your condition was God's will, while your soul screamed that God wanted something better for all his children. Education was another battleground. Learning to read and write was dangerous, forbidden in some states, restricted in others, always viewed with suspicion by white authorities who understood that literacy was power. A literate black person could read abolitionist newspapers smuggled down from the north. They could write passes for escaping enslaved people, forging the documents that might mean the difference between freedom and capture. They could communicate ideas that threatened the entire system, could correspond with allies, could record the injustices they witnessed for posterity. So states made it illegal to teach black people to read, free, or enslaved, punishing teachers and students alike. Schools for free black children were closed by law or by mob. Their teachers, sometimes white abolitionists, and sometimes free black people themselves, were arrested, fined, driven out of town, occasionally beaten. Students were dispersed, their books confiscated, their dreams of education criminalized. The message was clear. Ignorance was the natural condition for black people, and any attempt to change that condition was a crime against the social order. Some free black people learned anyway, in secret sessions conducted in back rooms and woods, with books hidden beneath floorboards, with lessons whispered so quietly that neighbors wouldn't hear. Parents taught children late at night, by candlelight, risking everything for the knowledge that might someday set them free in ways that legal freedom couldn't achieve. The hunger for knowledge was strong enough to risk punishment, because education represented something beyond practical skill. It represented the assertion that black minds were as capable as white minds, that the ideology of inferiority was a lie, that freedom might someday mean more than just not being owned. Every letter learned was an act of rebellion. Every word read was a victory against a system designed to keep black people in darkness. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because things went wrong constantly. A fire destroys your workshop, and you have no insurance, no savings, and no white guardian willing to extend credit. A recession hits, and the customers who tolerated you in good times find white craftsmen during hard times. A new law passes, and suddenly your occupation is restricted. Your residence is questioned. Your right to remain is challenged. You get sick, and there's no hospital that will admit you, no doctor willing to treat you, no safety net except whatever your community can provide. You grow old, and there's no pension, no retirement, no guarantee that you won't end your days in poverty no matter how hard you worked. The precariousness was exhausting. You could do everything right, follow every rule, defer to every white person, pay every tax, and still watch everything collapse because the system wasn't designed for you to succeed. It was designed to make you fail, to prove that free black people couldn't thrive, to justify either re-enslavement or expulsion as the only solutions to the problem of your existence. And through all of this, you watched the enslaved people around you and knew that their fate and yours were bound together. The same ideology that justified their chains justified your restrictions. The same fear that kept them in bondage kept you in this peculiar half-freedom. When enslaved people resisted, when they ran away or rebelled, the restrictions on free black people tightened. Every Nat Turner produced a wave of new laws aimed at all black people, free or enslaved, as if liberty itself were contagious and needed to be quarantined. You understood that your freedom, such as it was, existed only because it was useful to white people in some way, or because eliminating it would be more trouble than tolerating it. You were a pawn in a larger game. your status contingent on political calculations you couldn't influence, your future determined by debates in legislatures where you had no voice and no vote. Some free black people accumulated property anyway. Through skill, luck, and relentless work, they built businesses, bought land, even acquired wealth by the standards of their time. A few became genuinely prosperous, owning substantial property, employing workers, living in houses that rivaled those of middling white families. These success stories were remarkable precisely because they were so difficult, achieved against obstacles that would have crushed most people. But success brought its own dangers. A prosperous free black person attracted envy, resentment, accusations. White neighbors might claim that the property was acquired illegally, that the business competed unfairly, that something must be wrong because a black person couldn't possibly have earned what they had. Some successful free black people were driven out by mobs, their property destroyed, their years of work reduced to ashes. Others were cheated by white partners who knew that a black person couldn't testify against them in court. Still others simply disappeared, their fate unknown, their property absorbed by white neighbors who claimed it had been abandoned. The psychological weight of living this way was immense. You performed deference constantly, smiling when you wanted to scream, thanking people who insulted you, agreeing with opinions that denied your humanity. You learned to read white moods, to sense when danger was approaching, to make yourself small and unthreatening in situations where your size or confidence might be perceived as a challenge. You watched your words, knowing that the wrong comment to the wrong person could mean disaster. You watched your children, trying to teach them the survival skills they'd need, trying to prepare them for a world that hated them, without crushing the spirits that you wanted them to keep. The stress was constant. The vigilance was exhausting. The anger had nowhere to go except inward, where it curdled into something that had to be managed, controlled, hidden from the very people who caused it. And yet, free black people in the antebellum South didn't just survive. They built communities. They established churches and mutual aid societies. They created schools where they could, educated their children in secret where they couldn't. They maintained family connections across distances and legal barriers. They preserved traditions and created new ones. They found joy where joy could be found, in music and food and fellowship, in the small pleasures that couldn't be taxed or regulated away. They resisted in ways large and small, helping enslaved people escape, harboring runaways, passing information along networks that white people never fully understood. They held onto dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. They insisted on their humanity in a society that denied it. That insistence, that stubborn refusal to accept the terms being offered, was itself a form of resistance, a daily rebellion against the ideology that said they shouldn't exist. The end came eventually. The Civil War erupted. The Confederacy rose and fell. Emancipation became law, and then constitutional amendment. Suddenly all black people were free, at least on paper, and the peculiar category of free black Southerners disappeared into a larger population facing different but related challenges. But the antebellum period left its marks. The restrictions, the humiliations, the constant danger, the survival strategies, all of it shaped communities and families for generations. The knowledge that freedom could be conditional, that rights could be taken as easily as given, that white tolerance was not the same as white acceptance. This knowledge passed down through families who had learned it the hard way. The vigilance didn't disappear when slavery ended. It couldn't. The dangers simply evolved into new forms. Jim Crow replacing the black codes, sundown towns replacing expulsion laws, police replacing slave patrols. The free black people of the antebellum South had learned to navigate a world that wanted them gone or subjugated, and that skill would be needed for a long time to come. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it meant to be free in a land of slavery. Think about carrying papers that proved your humanity to people who denied it anyway. Think about building a life on ground that could shift beneath you at any moment. Think about loving people whose freedom you couldn't guarantee, raising children into a future you couldn't control. Think about the courage it took to simply exist, to wake up every morning and face another day of the obstacles designed to break you. The free black people of the antebellum South didn't choose their circumstances. They chose how to respond to them. They chose survival and community and resistance. They chose to treat each other as fully human even when the law and society said otherwise. They chose hope when despair would have been easier. That choice, made daily, made hourly, made in the face of everything that told them to give up, is what we remember tonight. Their freedom was compromised, constrained, constantly threatened, but it was theirs. They held onto it with everything they had, and eventually they expanded it to include everyone. Rest now and let their perseverance carry you into peaceful sleep. Congratulations, you've just woken up black in America in 1950. The good news is that slavery ended 85 years ago. The bad news is that nobody told the South, or the North really, but the South isn't even pretending anymore. You open your eyes in a small house in Montgomery, Alabama, or maybe Memphis or Jackson, or any of the 1,000 towns where the rules are written in custom and enforced with violence. The law says you're equal. The law is lying. Your life is governed by a system called Jim Crow, named after a minstrel character, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously your humanity is taken. Here's how the system works. You can't drink from the same water fountain as white people. You can't sit at the same lunch counter. You can't try on clothes in department stores because your skin might contaminate the fabric. You ride in the back of the bus, and if a white person needs your seat, you stand, or you get off, or you get arrested, or you get beaten, depending on the mood of the driver and the passengers and the police who might or might not show up. You can't swim in public pools. You can't use public restrooms in most places. You enter buildings through back doors if you're allowed to enter at all. The movie theater has a separate entrance, a separate staircase, a separate balcony where you sit in the dark and watch the same film as the white folks below, breathing the same air, which is apparently the only thing they'll share. The signs are everywhere, colored and white, over doorways, over fountains, over the entrances to parks and beaches and hospitals. The signs don't explain themselves. They don't need to. You learn to read them before you learn to read words. The humiliation is the point. Every interaction reminds you of your place, and your place is beneath. Not separate but equal, as the Supreme Court once pretended. Just separate, just less, just other. The water from the colored fountain is warm, the fountain itself rusted and poorly maintained. The white fountain is clean, cold, functional. The metaphor is so obvious it hurts. And if you forget your place, there are consequences. The Ku Klux Klan rides at night, burning crosses, burning houses, burning bodies. Lynching isn't history, it's current events. Black men are murdered for looking at white women, for being too successful, for asking to be paid fairly, for no reason at all except that someone felt like killing and knew they'd face no punishment. The sheriff is often in the Klan, the judge is often in the Klan, the jury is always white. Justice is a word that applies to other people. Between 1877 and 1950, over 4,000 black Americans were lynched, and those are just the ones that were documented. The real number is higher. The bodies that disappeared into rivers and swamps and unmarked graves, they don't show up in the statistics. You survive by learning the rules so deeply they become instinct. You step off the sidewalk when white people approach. You lower your eyes. You say, "Yes, sir," and "No, ma'am." And you never, ever let your anger show. The anger is there, of course. It's always there, burning in your chest. But you've learned to swallow it, because the alternative is death. Your parents taught you this. Their parents taught them. The knowledge passes down like an inheritance nobody wanted. You teach your children the same lessons, hating yourself for doing it, knowing it might save their lives. Look down. Speak softly. Don't run. Don't argue. Come home alive. But here's the thing about oppression. It requires cooperation. It requires the oppressed to accept, or at least to appear to accept, the terms of their subjugation. And in church basements and living rooms and barbershops across the South, people are starting to talk about what happens when they stop cooperating. The NAACP has been fighting legal battles for decades, chipping away at segregation case by case. Thurgood Marshall and his team of lawyers have been arguing before courts that separate is inherently unequal, building towards something big. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier spread stories of resistance and success to communities that white media ignores. Veterans who fought fascism in Europe are coming home and asking why they should accept fascism in Alabama. They stormed beaches at Normandy. They're not afraid of a bus driver in Birmingham. The ground is shifting. You can feel it beneath your feet. A tremor that could become an earthquake. Something is about to happen. It just needs a spark. The legal breakthrough comes first. Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The Supreme Court unanimously declares that segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The words ring like a bell across the country. In black communities, there's cautious celebration. Finally, the highest court has said what everyone knew. The system is wrong. But in the South, the reaction is fury. Georgia's governor promises that his state will never integrate. Mississippi forms a state sovereignty commission to fight desegregation. Politicians sign the Southern Manifesto, pledging massive resistance. The decision changes the law, but changing the law and changing reality are different things entirely. The spark that ignites the movement comes from a seamstress on a bus. December 1st, 1955, Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks is 42 years old, and she's tired. Not just physically tired, though she is that too. After a long day of work at a department store where she alters clothes but isn't allowed to try them on. She's tired of the humiliation, tired of the daily degradation, tired of a system designed to remind her that she doesn't matter. When the bus driver orders her to give up her seat to a white passenger, she refuses. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She just says no. The driver threatens to have her arrested. "You may do that," she says. And he does. Now here's what they don't always tell you. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired woman who spontaneously decided she'd had enough. She was a trained activist, the secretary of the local NAACP chapter, a woman who had attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, where she studied nonviolent resistance and movement building. She understood exactly what she was doing. Her arrest wasn't an accident. It was an opportunity. Black leaders in Montgomery had been waiting for a case like this. Someone respectable, someone unimpeachable, someone whose arrest could galvanize the community. There had been other arrests before, other women who refused to give up their seats, but their circumstances weren't right. Their backgrounds might be attacked. Rosa Parks was that person, a woman of impeccable character whose dignity could not be questioned. Within days, the Montgomery bus boycott begins. E.D. Nixon, a Pullman porter and union organizer, and Jo Ann Robinson, an English professor at Alabama State, worked through the night to organize. Robinson mimeographs thousands of flyers announcing the boycott, her hands stained with ink, the machine running until it nearly breaks. Black residents, who make up the majority of bus riders, simply stop riding. They walk to work, miles sometimes, in the December cold. They organize carpools, share rides, wear out their shoes on sidewalks that weren't designed for this much traffic. The bus company bleeds money. The city loses revenue. The white power structure is stunned. They expected this to last a few days, maybe a week. It lasts 381 days. You're part of this. You're waking up before dawn to walk to your job across town. Your feet ache. Your shoes have holes that you stuff with newspaper. But there's something in the air that wasn't there before. A feeling of collective power you've never experienced. At mass meetings in churches, you sing freedom songs and listen to speakers, including a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., just 26 years old, who talks about love and justice and nonviolent resistance in ways that make your heart race. He quotes the Bible and the Constitution and philosophers you've never heard of, weaving them together into something that sounds like prophecy. The boycott isn't just about buses anymore. It's about proving that black people can organize, can sacrifice, can win. The white response is predictable and vicious. Houses are bombed, including King's, with his wife Coretta and their baby daughter inside. They survive barely. A crowd of angry black men gathers outside, some of them armed, ready to retaliate. King walks onto his damaged porch and tells them to go home, to put away their weapons, to love their enemies. It's the first real test of non-violent philosophy under fire, and somehow it holds. Boycott leaders are arrested on trumped-up charges under an ancient anti-boycott law. King goes to jail for the first time. Insurance companies cancel policies on carpool vehicles. The city tries to shut down the taxi services that are helping people get to work. But the boycott holds. The walking becomes its own kind of protest, a daily declaration of dignity. An old woman, asked if her feet are tired, supposedly replies, "My feet is tired, but my soul is rested." Whether she actually said it doesn't matter. The sentiment is real. Every step is a vote. Every mile is a message. And in November 1956, the Supreme Court rules that bus segregation is unconstitutional. When the buses finally integrate, it feels like the world has shifted on its axis. It's just buses. It's just one city. But it's proof that change is possible. It's proof that ordinary people, organized and committed, can defeat a system that seemed invincible. The movement spreads, and so does the backlash. In Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students attempt to integrate Central High School in 1957. The governor, Orval Forbes, sends the National Guard not to protect them but to block them. You watch on television as these teenagers, dressed in their best clothes, walk toward the school while a white mob screams hatred, spits, threatens murder. One girl, Elizabeth Eckford, ends up separated from the group, alone against the crowd. Her face a mask of terrified composure as grown adults shriek at her. The photograph of her becomes iconic, becomes impossible to explain away, becomes an indictment that the whole world can see. President Eisenhower, reluctantly, sends federal troops to escort the students. For the first time since Reconstruction, the federal government uses military force to protect black civil rights. Soldiers with bayonets walk children to algebra class. The symbolism is extraordinary and terrible, but troops can't protect you from everything. Inside the school, the Little Rock Nine face daily torment. They're shoved into lockers, tripped on stairs, called names that nobody should have to hear. Someone throws acid in one girl's eyes. Another is kicked down a flight of stairs. They endure a year of violence for the right to learn what white students learn. Think about that. Children fighting for education, treated like enemy combatants in their own country. And these are the ones who make the news. In thousands of other schools across the South, integration doesn't happen at all. The law says one thing, reality says another. The next wave comes from unexpected quarters. College students. Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1st, 1960. 4 freshmen from North Carolina A&T, a black college, walk into a Woolworth's department store. They buy some school supplies, keep their receipts to prove they're paying customers, then sit down at the whites-only lunch counter and order coffee. The waitress refuses to serve them. They don't move. They sit there, polite, patient, until the store closes. They come back the next day, and the next. Within 2 weeks, the sit-in has grown to over 300 students. Within 2 months, the movement has spread to 54 cities in 9 states. The sit-in movement explodes across the South. Nashville, Atlanta, Birmingham, dozens of cities see black students sitting quietly at lunch counters while white mobs pour ketchup and mustard on their heads, burn cigarettes on their necks and arms, beat them with fists and clubs. The students don't fight back. They've been trained in non-violent resistance, drilled in workshops where they practiced being insulted, being hit, staying calm. In Nashville, the workshops are run by James Lawson, a divinity student who studied Gandhian non-violence in India. Students take turns playing the roles of protesters and attackers, learning to absorb blows, to go limp when dragged, to protect their heads and vital organs without striking back. The discipline is extraordinary. You watch a young man get coffee poured over his head, and he doesn't flinch, doesn't raise his hands, just keeps sitting there, dignity intact despite everything. A young woman is pulled from her seat and kicked repeatedly. She doesn't cry out. She doesn't fight. She just curls up and waits for it to be over, then gets back on her seat. The violence exposes the ugliness of segregation in ways that arguments never could. Television cameras capture white adults beating children for sitting peacefully. The images are broadcast across the nation, across the world. Segregation has always relied on being invisible to those who benefit from it. The sit-ins make it impossible to look away. Here's what nonviolence actually meant. It wasn't passive, it was strategic. The movement understood that they would never win a violent confrontation. The state had all the weapons, all the power, all the legitimacy to use force. What the movement had was moral authority, but only if they could maintain it. Every act of white violence against peaceful protesters shifted public opinion. Every photograph of a well-dressed student being brutalized made segregation harder to defend. The suffering was real, but it was also tactical. This was warfare by other means, and the battlefield was the conscience of white America. You're drawn into the movement now, maybe reluctantly at first. Maybe you're scared, and you should be. People are dying for this, but you can't stay on the sidelines anymore. You attend mass meetings where the singing shakes the walls, where the pews are packed so tight you can barely breathe, where the spirit moves through the crowd like electricity. We shall overcome. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. This little light of mine. We are not afraid. The songs aren't just music, they're courage made audible, a way of transforming fear into determination. You learn to link arms with strangers who become family because you're risking everything together. The person beside you might be a preacher or a domestic worker, a college professor or a sharecropper. In the movement, those distinctions blur. The students organize themselves into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC. They're young, impatient, willing to take risks that older leaders won't. They push the movement forward, sometimes clashing with the established organizations like the NAACP and King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The energy is incredible, the debates passionate, the commitment total. These young people are remaking themselves and the country at the same time. The Freedom Rides come in 1961. The Supreme Court has ruled that segregation in interstate bus terminals is unconstitutional, but the South ignores the ruling. Integrated groups of activists board buses in Washington, D.C., heading into the Deep South to test whether the law means anything. They know what they're riding into. They've written their wills. They've prepared themselves for prison, for beatings, possibly for death. In Anniston, Alabama, a mob slashes the tires of one bus, follows it out of town, and firebombs it. The riders nearly burn alive as the mob holds the doors shut. They escape only when the fuel tank explodes and the mob fears for their own safety. The photographs show the bus in flames, black smoke rising against an Alabama sky. Freedom riders collapsed on the grass with smoke inhalation. In Birmingham, the police conveniently disappear for 15 minutes, while Klansmen attack riders with pipes, baseball bats, bicycle chains. One man is beaten so badly, he requires over 50 stitches and suffers permanent brain damage. The photos go worldwide. International embarrassment forces the Kennedy administration to act. The Interstate Commerce Commission finally enforces desegregation of terminals. It took burning buses and broken skulls to make a Supreme Court decision real. Birmingham, 1963. The movement decides to target the most segregated city in America, the city where bombings are so common. Black neighborhoods call it Bombingham, the city where Bull Connor runs, public safety like his personal fiefdom. Connor is exactly what his name suggests, a bull-headed racist who will provide the confrontation the movement needs. The theory is called Project C, with C standing for confrontation. The movement will provoke Connor into violent overreaction, and the violence will be broadcast to the nation, building pressure for federal civil rights legislation. Martin Luther King is arrested on Good Friday and writes his letter from Birmingham jail, scrawling it in the margins of a newspaper, on scraps of paper smuggled in by his lawyers. It's a masterpiece of moral argument addressed to white moderates who counsel patience. For years now, I have heard the word wait, he writes. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. He distinguishes between just and unjust laws. He invokes Socrates and Jesus and the Hebrew prophets. He writes about the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, and argues that they are a greater obstacle than the Klan. The letter is smuggled out and published, becoming one of the foundational documents of the movement. But the campaign is struggling. Adults are reluctant to march, afraid of losing jobs they can't afford to lose, afraid of violence they've seen too much of, afraid for their families. The jails aren't filling fast enough. Then James Bevel, a young SCLC organizer with a shaved head and overalls, has an idea. Use the children. It sounds insane. It is insane. King himself hesitates, but they're running out of options. On May 2nd, Over 1,000 black students skip school and march downtown, singing freedom songs. Some are 6 years old, some are 18. They march in waves, and Bull Connor arrests them all. The jails overflow. They put children in the fairgrounds, in makeshift detention centers. The next day, more children march. Connor loses whatever restraint he had. He orders fire hoses turned on them, the pressure strong enough to strip bark from trees, to rip clothes from bodies, to send small children tumbling down the street like leaves. He releases police dogs. The photographs are horrifying. A German shepherd lunging at a teenage boy named Walter Gadsden. Children pinned against walls by water cannons. Girls in Sunday dresses knocked off their feet by the force of the spray. You're in Birmingham now, and you can't believe what you're seeing. These are children, some younger than your own, facing down men with hoses and dogs. They're terrified and brave in equal measure, and their courage is breaking something open in the national conscience. The images go around the world. President Kennedy reportedly says the photographs make him sick. He goes on television and calls civil rights a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. Within weeks, Birmingham's white business leaders agree to desegregate lunch counters, drinking fountains, and fitting rooms. It's a victory purchased with the suffering of children, and nobody pretends the cost wasn't obscene. The summer of 1963 accelerates toward a climax. Medgar Evers, NAACP Field Secretary in Mississippi, is assassinated in his driveway on June 12th. He'd been organizing voter registration, investigating murders, pushing Mississippi toward justice. A white supremacist named Byron de la Beckwith shoots him in the back with a rifle as Evers gets out of his car. His wife Merle and their children find him bleeding on the doorstep, his keys still in his hand, a stack of NAACP t-shirts reading "Jim Crow must go" scattered around him. He dies an hour later. 2 all-white juries deadlock on Beckwith's guilt. He walks free. Justice won't come for 30 years. In response to the mounting pressure, plans crystallize for a massive march on Washington to demand civil rights legislation. The idea isn't new. Philip Randolph had proposed a similar march in 1941, threatening it until President Roosevelt integrated defense industries to head it off. Now Randolph's vision finally becomes reality. On August 28, 1963, over 250,000 people gather at the Lincoln Memorial, the largest political demonstration in American history to that point. Black and white together, stretching from the monument to the Washington Memorial. A sea of humanity demanding justice. You're there. You took a bus that left at midnight, sat upright all night with your neighbors and strangers who became friends somewhere around Philadelphia. You're exhausted and exhilarated. The heat is brutal, the sun relentless. You stand for hours, pressing toward the reflecting pool, trying to see the speakers who look tiny in the distance. Some speeches are forgettable. Some are powerful. John Lewis, just 23 years old, delivers a fiery address that's been toned down at the last minute because other leaders found it too radical. He still manages to ask, which side is the federal government on? The crowd roars. And then Martin Luther King takes the podium. He starts with his prepared text, solid but formal, about the promissory note America has defaulted on. Then Mahalia Jackson, the great gospel singer standing behind him, calls out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And he does. He sets aside his notes and he preaches. His voice rises and falls in rhythms that reach into your chest and grab your heart. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You're crying now, and so is the woman next to you. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. The words wash over you like a baptism, like something holy and impossible and necessary. Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. The crowd explodes. For a moment, just a moment. The America King is describing feels possible, feels imminent, feels like you could reach out and touch it. The moment fades, but the memory stays. 18 days later, a bomb explodes at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, the church that had been a staging ground for the children's marches. 4 little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, are killed. They were in the basement, changing into their choir robes, talking about the first day of school. The youngest was 11. The bomb blows a hole in the wall, buries them in rubble. 22 others are injured. A young girl staggers out of the wreckage, her clothes blown off, her sister dead beneath the debris. The violence hasn't stopped. The hatred hasn't softened. The dream feels very far away, but the movement doesn't stop. Stopping would mean the deaths meant nothing. President Kennedy has submitted a civil rights bill to Congress. Then Kennedy himself is assassinated in November. Lyndon Johnson, the new president, takes up the cause, using his legendary legislative skills and the nation's grief to push the bill forward. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passes after the longest filibuster in Senate history, Southern senators talking for 57 days trying to kill it. The law outlaws discrimination in public accommodations, in employment, in federally funded programs. It's a landmark achievement, the most significant civil rights legislation in a century. And it's not enough, because there's another right, more fundamental than lunch counters, that the South is still denying: the right to vote. On paper, black men have had voting rights since 1870. In practice, the South has constructed an elaborate system to prevent black voters from registering. Literacy tests that white applicants never have to take, administered by registrars who decide whether your answers are correct. Poll taxes that poor people can't afford. Questions impossible to answer correctly, like how many bubbles in a bar of soap, or how many grains of sand on this beach. Registrars who are only open during working hours, who lose paperwork, who simply refuse to register anyone black and dare you to do something about it. And behind all the bureaucratic obstruction stands the threat of violence. Register to vote, lose your job. Organize voter registration, lose your life. Mississippi is the hardest. In 1964, only 6% of eligible black voters are registered. Some counties with majority black populations have no black voters at all. Civil rights organizations launch Freedom Summer, bringing white college students from the North to work alongside black activists on voter registration. The theory is that violence against white Northerners will attract national attention in ways that violence against black Mississippians hasn't. It's a grim calculation, an acknowledgement that white lives are valued more highly by the media and the public. The theory proves correct in the worst possible way. 3 workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappear in June. Chaney is black, from Mississippi, 21 years old. Goodman and Schwerner are white, from New York, 20 and 24. They were investigating a church burning when they were arrested by a deputy sheriff, held in jail until dark, released, and then abducted by Klansmen. The FBI searches for 44 days. The national press covers it obsessively because 2 of the victims are white. Their bodies are found buried in an earthen dam. Cheney had been savagely beaten before being shot. The coroner says he'd never seen bones so badly shattered. The summer continues despite the terror, maybe because of it. Volunteers face constant harassment, beatings, bombings. 37 churches are burned. 30 homes and businesses are bombed. Over 1,000 people are arrested. 6 people are murdered. 80 are beaten. And still they knock on doors. Still, they try to convince terrified sharecroppers that registering to vote is worth the risk. Some do register, though the numbers are small. They risk everything for a ballot. Selma, Alabama, 1965. The movement chooses this city for a voting rights campaign because only 2% of eligible black voters are registered despite years of effort. The sheriff, Jim Clark, is another Bull Connor, a violent racist who wears a button reading "Never" on his lapel and keeps a cattle prod on his belt. For weeks, activists march to the courthouse to register. For weeks, they're beaten, arrested, driven back. A young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson is shot by a state trooper while trying to protect his mother and grandfather during a nighttime march. He dies 8 days later. The response is a march from Selma to Montgomery, 54 miles, to demand voting rights. On March 7, 600 marchers set out across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named for a Confederate general and Klan leader. On the other side, state troopers and sheriff's deputies wait in a line across the highway. They give the marchers 2 minutes to disperse. Then they attack. Tear gas, billy clubs, men on horseback riding down unarmed people. John Lewis has his skull fractured by a trooper's nightstick. Amelia Boynton is beaten unconscious and lies bleeding on the pavement. The footage airs that night, interrupting a television movie about Nazi war crimes, and America watches in horror as uniformed officers brutalize American citizens whose only crime is wanting to vote. You're in Selma. You were on that bridge. Your eyes still burn from the tear gas. There's blood in your hair from where a troopers club caught you. You're scared in ways you've never been scared before. And you're also certain, absolutely certain, that this matters more than your fear. The day becomes known as Bloody Sunday. It's a turning point. President Johnson goes before Congress and uses the movement's own words. We shall overcome. The Voting Rights Act passes in August. The act transforms Southern politics. Federal registrars replace hostile local officials. The literacy tests disappear. The poll taxes are struck down. Within 2 years, black voter registration in Mississippi jumps from 6% to nearly 60%. Black officials begin winning elections at local, state, and eventually national levels. The political map of the South starts to shift in ways that continue to this day. But the movement is changing too, and not all the changes feel like progress. The cities of the North explode in riots. Watts in 1965, Detroit and Newark in 1967. Frustration boiling over in places where legal segregation never existed, but poverty and police brutality and housing discrimination created their own kind of oppression. These aren't Jim Crow states. These are cities where black families fled seeking freedom and found ghettos instead. Martin Luther King turns his attention to economic justice, to the Vietnam War, to issues that make him more enemies than friends. His popularity drops. His allies fracture. Some younger activists reject nonviolence, embrace black power, demand immediate change instead of patient suffering. You feel the shift. The unity of the early movement fractures into competing visions. Some want integration, some want separation, some want revolution. Stokely Carmichael raises his fist and shouts "Black Power" at a rally in Mississippi, and the phrase becomes a lightning rod. It means different things to different people. Self-defense, economic independence, cultural pride, political organization. The media mostly hears violence, which isn't fair, but isn't entirely wrong either. The Black Panthers carry guns in Oakland, following police cars to monitor arrests, daring the state to respond. The singing at mass meetings feels different now, more defiant, less hopeful. The dream that felt so close in Washington seems to recede with every passing year. Progress has been made, real progress, but the promised land isn't here yet, and you're tired, so tired of walking. April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King is in Memphis, supporting a sanitation workers' strike. The workers, almost all black, carry signs reading "I am a man," demanding basic recognition of their humanity. King has been talking about death lately, about the threats against his life, about not fearing any man. The night before, he gave a speech at the Mason Temple that now reads like prophecy. "I've been to the mountaintop," he said, "and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next evening, standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, he's shot by an assassin. You hear the news on the radio, and something inside you breaks. The man who taught you about love and non-violence, who made you believe that redemption was possible for a country that had done so much evil, is dead. Cities burned that night, over 100 of them, flames rising in grief and rage. Washington, Chicago, Baltimore, Kansas City. The smoke rises over American cities like a funeral pyre. It feels like the end of something. Maybe it is. But here's what the history books sometimes miss. The movement didn't die with King. It transformed, splintered, continued in 1,000 different forms. The Black Power movement channeled rage into pride, into community programs, into a new assertion of identity and worth. The Panthers ran free breakfast programs for children, health clinics, schools. The women who had always been the backbone of the movement, often uncredited and overlooked, carried their organizing skills into feminism, into welfare rights, into local politics. Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Ella Baker, Septima Clark. They kept working long after the cameras left. The young people who had marched as children grew up to become mayors and congressmen and professors and parents who raised the next generation with different expectations. And you carried it forward too, in ways large and small. Maybe you registered voters for the rest of your life. Maybe you taught your children the history, made sure they understood what was sacrificed so they could drink from any fountain, sit at any counter, vote at any polling place. Maybe you just lived with more dignity because the movement gave you permission to demand it. The movement wasn't just the famous names and the famous moments. It was millions of ordinary people making choices that added up to change. The work wasn't finished. It's still not finished. The Voting Rights Act has been gutted by the Supreme Court. Mass incarceration has created new forms of racial control. Police violence against black people continues to spark protests that echo the marches of the 60s. The Dream King spoke of remains just that, a dream, beautiful and unrealized. Every generation discovers that the fight for justice doesn't end. It just changes form. But here's what you carry with you, lying in your bed tonight, thinking about all those people who came before. They proved something. They proved that ordinary people, organized and committed, can change the world. Not quickly, not easily, not without suffering that would break most of us. But they did it. They walked when they couldn't ride. They sat when they couldn't stand. They marched into violence and didn't turn back. They loved their enemies, or at least acted like they did, because that was the only way forward. The civil rights movement wasn't a single story with a clear ending. It was 1,000 stories, interwoven, sometimes contradicting each other, stretching from the first enslaved person who ran for freedom to the teenager protesting tonight. You're part of that story, whether you know it or not. The choices you make, the stands you take, the silences you refuse to keep, they all connect to that long line of people who decided that things could be different. So tonight, as you settle into whatever comfort you've been given, think about those who had no comfort at all. Think about the woman who said no on a bus. Think about the children who faced down dogs and fire hoses. Think about the young men who boarded buses into violence and the old women who walked miles to work rather than ride in the back. They were scared. They were tired. They did it anyway. And because they did, the world you live in is different. Not perfect, not finished, but different. The movement is a gift passed down through generations, a reminder that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice only if people bend it. You can rest now. You've earned this moment of peace, bought by people who never got to rest, who gave everything they had so you could lie here free. Honor them by remembering. Honor them by continuing. The work goes on. It always goes on. And somewhere, in some church basement or living room or street corner, someone is starting again, picking up where the last generation left off, refusing to accept what is because they can imagine what could be. That's the story. That's the whole story. And it doesn't end until justice does.